Hello friends, welcome to a new episode of Drishti IAS Editorial Analysis. In this editorial analysis, we do three things. We link the editorial to the UPSC Civil Services exam syllabus. We understand the key points of the editorial, and we also look at any key concepts that have come in the editorial and are important from exam point of view. So let us begin today's editorial analysis. Today's editorial has been taken from The Hindu and it has appeared on 20th of April. The title of the editorial is Economy in Lockdown. After the IMF's revised projections, India must adopt plans that avert the worst case scenario. So let us look at the linkage of the editorial with the UPSC syllabus. So it links directly with GS paper 3, which talks about economic development. And under this, Indian economy and issues relating to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Secondly, it also relates to GS paper 2, where we have international relations, and under this we have important international institutions. Because the editorial is about IMF and its projections on the world economy and the Indian economy. Let us look at the key points. Editorial says that after the IMF's revised projections, India must adopt plans that avert the worst case scenario. So whenever any projection is made, we have three cases. We have a high case, which is also known as an optimistic scenario. We have the base case, which is more or less the realistic scenario, and a low case, which is pessimistic scenario. So India must make plans so that it can avoid this low or pessimistic scenario where everything that can go wrong goes wrong. It further says that the pandemic induced great lockdown. So a new terminology has been introduced about great lockdown. It has a connect with the Great Depression of 1929, which we'll see later in the key concept section. So the pandemic induced great lockdown has forced the IMF to junk all its previous projections for economic output in 2020. So IMF was somewhat upbeat earlier about growth scenario, but now it has junked all its previous projections and it has revised the figures. Editorial further says that faced with the stark reality, that means the bitter truth of sweeping shutdowns, there have been shutdowns all over the world, where almost entire economies worldwide have been shut down for any kind of economic activity. Only the basic essential activities are being allowed. So IMF has acknowledged that the current crisis is like no other. So there has been no such precedent. The closest that we can come to any such crisis is the Great Depression of 1929. Forecasting the sharpest contraction in the world output since the Great Depression of the 1930s, the IMF has slashed its projections made in January 2020 for 3.3% growth to a 3% decline. So what the IMF had done, it has projected in January 2020, which is just 3 months back, that a 3.3% growth rate will be observed in the world GDP. But now it is saying that the world GDP will not grow, rather it will contract by 3%. Now let us understand it with the help of a graph. This graph has been taken from the World Economic Outlook, which is a major publication of IMF and important from exam point of view. You should know that IMF publishes World Economic Outlook, also known as WEO in short. Here in this graph, we can see that the Great Lockdown 2020, it will lead to a contraction of 3% in the world economic output. Whereas the global financial crisis, which was one of the major crises that the world has seen in this century, it was just minus 0.1%. So one can see the difference between minus 0.1% and minus 3%. So this is a huge figure. Now let us get back to the editorial. Now why IMF has been projecting wild figures, or why the IMF's projection is going haywire. So in its defense, IMF has been kind of misled by the comments from Chinese authorities and WHO regarding the extent and spread of this pandemic. Because even on 22nd Feb, in a meeting of the G20 finance ministers, the IMF chief, who is Kristalina Georgieva, who comes from Bulgaria, she had told that global growth would be only about 0.1% lower than the forecast made in January. So in January, the IMF had made a forecast of 3.3% growth in world economy. And on February 22nd, in the meeting of the G20 finance ministers, the IMF chief is saying that there will be a contraction in this figure by only 0.1%. But now they have revised it to minus 3%, that there will be no growth, rather it will be a contraction in the world economic output, and that too of 3%. So this points to a very grim scenario. Now IMF had then stated that China's GDP would expand by 5.6% this year, but now it has again revised that to a growth of only 1.2%. So even Chinese growth, or the Chinese economy's growth, has been brought down from 5.6% to 1.2% in IMF's projections. And China is also known as world's factory. So if the world is not in a position to buy, obviously the world's factory will also suffer the consequences. So the editorial is saying that still in projecting an annual expansion in China, the IMF is still being rather optimistic and there can be further revisions. Now let us look at what IMF is saying about India and India's growth story. IMF has also cut the projection for growth in the fiscal year that started on April 1 from January's 5.8% to 1.9%. So even India's projected economic growth from 5.8% has been cut down to 1.9% in the light of this pandemic. And this again appears predicated on the fund's baseline scenario that assumes that the pandemic would fade in the second half of 2020. So the IMF is hoping that in the second half of 2020, we'll have more control over this pandemic and the economic activities will revive to some extent. But in making this assumption, IMF is relying that there will be a lot of policy support to nurture the revival once the activity restarts in the economy. So this is a major assumption behind IMF's being optimistic. Otherwise, we are in for a very tough time. The IMF chief economist, Geeta Gopinath, now her name is important and we should know that. She's of Indian origin. Now, IMF has always been a poster boy of fiscal conservatism. But in this scenario, even the IMF chief economist, Geeta Gopinath, she has also advocated ramping up of a broad-based and coordinated stimulus once the disease has been contained. So even IMF is now not sticking to fiscal conservatism because it realizes that desperate times calls for desperate measures. And the IMF feels that it would also help avoid the errors of the Great Depression years when the premature efforts to prune budget deficits prolonged the crisis. So what happened during Great Depression? People were more concerned about pruning the budget deficit as soon as they got some control over the situation. And that led to the crisis getting more and more serious and also prolonging it. So that mistake should be avoided this time. That is what the IMF's prescription is for India and other countries as well. Editorial says that in this context, India's fiscal measures pale in terms of scale when compared with what several other nations have undertaken. So we know that India has only given a financial stimulus package which is about 1% of India's GDP, whereas other countries have gone ahead and announced stimulus amounting to almost 10% of their GDP. A country like Malaysia has gone ahead to about 18% of its GDP. But a country like India, the financial stimulus has to be somewhere close to 10% of the GDP. So that is where India is lagging behind at present. And the Indian government must take note of this. The editorial finally says that given the size of the informal sector in India, as well as the anticipated prolonged disruption in labor supply, even in the more formal parts of the economy, because the migrant laborers have left for their homes. So even if the factories want to restart, the laborers are not there. So that is going to be a difficult task to bring them back. So it is very important that the center realizes this challenge and it needs to proactively commit to a substantial stimulus package in order to ensure that once the economy reopens, it has the legs to run. Because once the economic activities restart, the government's job is not finished. The government will have to ensure that the companies restart, the factories restart, and they are able to sustain. So these were the key points in the editorial. Now let us look at the key concepts. Today's key concepts section will look at two concepts, International Monetary Fund and the Great Depression. So the IMF was created in 1945 and it is governed by and is accountable to its 189 member countries. So IMF was created along with its sister organization which is the World Bank, and both of them are together known as Bretton Woods institutions because that is the place where they were established. This is important from exam point of view. We should be knowing this. But IMF's primary purpose is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, such as the system of exchange rates and international payments that enables countries to transact with each other. So that is why IMF is very important because it ensures the stability of the international monetary system. And the fund's mandate was updated in 2012 to include all macroeconomic and financial sector issues that bear on global stability. Then the IMF also provides financial assistance to its member countries through allocation of special drawing rights and quota based on economic size and other parameters. Now these special drawing rights, this is an important topic, but because of paucity of time, we will not be discussing this, but this is important from exam point of view and you should know about this. Now the member quotas are the primary source of IMF financial resources, and a member's quota broadly reflects its size and position in the world economy. We should also know about the important publications that IMF brings out, and the most important is the World Economic Outlook, and there is also a Global Financial Stability Report which it brings out. And these are also important from exam point of view. Now let us look at the Great Depression. Originated in the USA when stock markets crashed on October 24, 1929. So this is an important date. And this date is known as Black Thursday. And Black Thursday was followed by a Black Tuesday when the prices went totally bust. Later it spread to the capitalist countries of Europe, well connected with the USA after the First World War. So in First World War, USA helped these European countries and they had taken a lot of debt from the US. So the economies of USA and these European countries were interconnected. And that is why when problems started in USA, the European countries also felt the same. And the worst phase of this crisis was between 1929 to 1933. And what were the causes of it? So there were rapid selling of stocks in the USA during the phase of prosperity in the 1920s. So a stock market bubble was building up. And this bubble of the stock market bursted in 1929. And the lack of available investment for manufacturers, it led to widespread unemployment. Then the loss of purchasing power due to lower income caused by unemployment. So all the factors were kind of interrelated, interconnected. And the First World War also took a toll on the economy. Now what were the consequences? Large-scale unemployment increased from 3% in 1929 to a whopping 25% in 1933. Trade totally collapsed. There was sharp fall in tax revenues, personal incomes and profits. There was loss of investment and savings, very understandable. Then the real GDP also declined. Then agriculture distress, as farmers were unable to sell their produce because nobody was earning, people were unemployed. And this had a great impact on the society, politics and international relations. Now what were the remedial measures? So Herbert Hoover was the president of US when this crisis started. And there was an establishment of Reconstruction Finance Corporation to provide financial aid to business corporations, agriculture, public works and financial institutions. Herbert Hoover was initially not inclined to have government help these individuals who were suffering due to depression. But later on, he had to change his mind because of the widespread distress in the economy. Franklin Roosevelt defeated him in the elections in 1933 and he promised a New Deal. This is also an important concept. And what did this New Deal entail? It entailed issuing of new banknotes, measures were taken to provide relief to the unemployed, civilian conservation corps to hire unemployed people for rural projects, which we see in India in Manrega, something like that. Then mortgage relief to farmers and homeowners. So farmers and homeowners who had mortgaged their houses or fields, they were also provided relief. Then a Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate the US stock markets because the problem originated with the stock markets, a role which is performed by SEBI in India. Then a National Industrial Recovery Act to raise wages, lower working hours for the workers. And a social security and economic security for the elderly, for the poor and the sick. So for the most vulnerable sections of the population, some social security was instituted. So this had a great impact on the American society and also on the world economy. So this is important also from world history point of view because it's a landmark event in the world history. Here are all the key points in today's editorial and the key concepts. Now from exam point of view, what we must know from PT and mains perspective. So PT, we have to know some important facts like when IMF was established, which are its important publications and so on. And the year of the Great Depression, the causes, etc. But in mains, it will be more about like what are the steps and measures that the government can take to mitigate the crisis due to COVID-19 pandemic on the economic front. So those are the kind of questions that can be asked. One can be asked to compare the issues between Great Depression or the cause of Great Depression or the consequences of Great Depression with the Great Lockdown. This was all in today's editorial analysis. See you next time with another editorial. Thank you.